Sarah. I'm with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and my primary role at the council is to staff our Regional Resiliency Coalition, which formed in 2018 and is modeled after the Southeast Compacts Coalition, which Dr. Gerardo is a part of. Our coalition has just adopted our first Regional Resiliency Action Plan in 2022, and we've been working with Susan Glickman on how to implement that plan and how to really integrate the priorities of our coalition into our local policies and make sure that our policies are consistent across the region. So we really are grateful to have Susan helping us today to put this webinar together, and grateful for all of you who signed up and are interested in hearing more about this effort. So I'm going to let Susan introduce the rest of our panelists. And again, thank you all for joining us. I think this is a really important topic.
Kara, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work that you're doing and the rest of the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council's staff in pushing forward our Regional Resiliency Coalition. And really excited to be here today. We're joined by two good friends of mine, Dr. Jennifer Gerardo, who's the Chief Resilience Officer in Broward County. And as Kara mentioned, she's a principal leader in the Southeast Florida Compact, which formed more than 15 years ago. And we'll probably talk about some of that and help to inspire the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition, as well as the East Central Florida Regional Resilience Collaborative. And that's really important. And we're going to dig into that today because these collaboratives are and resilience entities are really leading on a lot of this work going forward in the planning. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And Kathleen Beckman, who is a city council member in Clearwater, just sort of north of where we are. We were having a sort of a Midwestern conversation here earlier. For those who don't know, Tampa Bay is filled with Midwestern people. And I think it's probably a little slower than Southeast Florida. So it's really emblematic of how the rest of the country is with Midwestern values. So Kathleen and her husband, she retired as a high school English teacher, among other things, and retired to the Tampa Bay area. And they have jumped into making this a better place and become incredibly, active in the community, and very bravely ran for office, which I appreciate, and she's leading. So you'll hear from her in a little bit. And also wanted to mention my colleague, Kim Ross, who's the executive director of Rethink Energy Florida, and she's helping for this on the back end. And you're going to hear about the Upper Limit Project. And it's really going to be sort of an intriguing conversation, I think, for everyone here today, because we're going to talk through the technical side of, what's going on with sea rise, what's going on with, climate pollution that's warming the planet, causing, glaciers to melt and our ice sheets, which is raising our seas. And we're going to kind of walk through where we're at, but we're also going to talk about a narrative to help move action given where we are today. So a lot of the activities around, climate change are with the federal government, and there's a lot of dollars, incentives coming down to states and to local governments, and we need to be positioned to take advantage of that. So we need to understand that there are policies, programs, plans that we need to keep under this upper limit at which Florida can withstand and still remain our economically prosperous. So Kim Ross and I've been working on this project with a number of folks, experts, scientists, and we're going to talk through that for a couple years now. And so this is both going to help you think through the technical side, how we plan, but also how we talk about this issue. Climate change is often talked about in terms of degrees. Paris Accords, the agreement to keep under the 1.5 Celsius. And part of our premise here is that most people don't know what a 1.5 means, and they don't know it's Celsius. and they really don't know what it means as a practical matter to their lives, to their communities, to the costs. So that's where the upper limit project was born, and that there is an upper limit. And what we are asking is the state of Florida to recognize that there is a limit. And that we then have an imperative to adopt the policies, the programs to keep us under this upper limit at which our economy, and on the call, we all know that agriculture, tourism, construction, real estate, and ports are really the pillar of Florida's economy, and they are all impacted by this warming climate. So let's go to the next slide, Kim. I think that's you. So we've already seen about a foot of sea rise, and sea rise is interesting because even if one was to turn the CO2 spigot off tomorrow, those seas are going to keep rising for some time. I mean, eventually, that's going to level out, but we're on track for 2 feet of sea rise. And we want to encourage people to use these feet measurements because people actually sort of know what that means. Though I don't know that most people realize that it's 6 inches, you can have saltwater intrusion. I know Dr. Hirata will talk more about this later, because certainly in Broward County, they are experiencing a fair amount of sea rise inland flooding. So you get, more flooding, you get sewage backups, which they've certainly seen, particularly around the Fort Lauderdale area. And I don't think most people understand that drinking water, seawater can get into drinking water at a relatively low level. So it's taking these big grandiose concepts, and the concept of climate pollution warming our planet has, up to this point, really for most people, seemed to be a very far afield thing down the road. But the reality is we're experiencing things now. Flooding is a perfect example. So it's one thing to adapt to 2 feet. It's another thing to go beyond 2 feet. So we've got a foot that we've already experienced roughly. We've got a foot, another foot baked in. So the decisions we make now are going to determine, are we looking at 3 feet and 4 feet? And I know a lot of people on the call are planners, and this is what we all need to be thinking about. So there's what we know, and then there are the unknowns. But beyond 2 feet, in my opinion, it's too much, because you get exponentially higher, loss for property, water, sewage systems failing, our shoreline, saltwater intrusion, what's happening, with our very fragile ecosystems. So this is really the moment where we are right now. We're in this dilemma, and the state of Florida, unfortunately, has primarily focused on adaptation. Now we need to do that. And I think we could go to the next slide. We absolutely need to adapt. And Dr. Hirata was going to talk more about what they've been doing, because in Southeast Florida, they got started on this about 15 years ago. And as Kara mentioned, the Tampa Bay Regional Resilience Coalition only formed in 2018. So there's a lot of experience we can pull from. So these are some of the recent floods, and we're all seeing it. So next slide. So the project, the Upper Limit Project's mission is to shift in what has been a primarily adaptation-only conversation to one that actually does focus on reducing the driver of this pollution. So in order to stay below the upper limit of where Florida can remain economically viable, and the scientists that we convened, and we can talk more about that process, really came together around the 2 foot mark. So we must prioritize these climate pollution reduction strategies and actually get at the root cause of the problem. So that's essential, and it's going to impact the work of all of us and everyone on this call. So next slide. Good. So, and we have some background and materials, a number of us led by a gentleman named Rafe Pomerantz and Len Berry, both scientists. Rafe was featured in the New York Times Magazine, where the entire section was devoted to climate change a couple of years ago, called Losing Earth. And he had been in Clinton's State Department, and there was a moment where they thought they were really going to get some action on climate change. And of course, as we know, sometimes politics gets in the way. So we've developed materials, we convene scientists around, how do we keep Florida above water, with a narrative that really boils it down for the public and business community and elected officials to understand the challenge here, and to really come to grips with the fact that it's not enough to just adapt, to just raise seawalls, because at some point you cannot adapt your way out of climate change if we continue to add to the problem. So we'll share when we share slides, and we'll share these materials with everyone so you have them to use in your community. So next slide. So what we would like to see, and I know, whether it's a regional government or a local government, we would like for the state of Florida and for local governments to recognize that there is an upper limit. We want to build support to establish these policies that are going to actually move us in the other direction. And we believe that the state of Florida should also be a leader nationally and internationally, because the big ad campaign, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. Well, what happens in the Arctic and in the Antarctic doesn't stay there. It's going to affect us in Florida and around the world. And we're very, very vulnerable, to sea rise on so many levels. And then you add the hurricane intensity and the storm surge. And so we're looking at some really difficult impacts here, particularly in Florida, but really all over the world. So we need meaningful action at the national and international levels so that we have an emissions reduction strategy that's consistent with keeping us under the upper limit. We can't divorce these two things, because you cannot adapt your way out of this problem. So then we need the policies and programs. I'll speak to it a little more later, but Florida is getting 5 of the metropolitan statistical areas are getting EPA planning grants for climate pollution. So this is a real opportunity for a big swath of the state of Florida to have a roadmap to do the last goal, which is to implement widespread renewable energy, energy efficiency, solar, battery storage, advancing the electrification of transportation, whether it's transit, buses, school buses, or individual electric vehicles. So we got to get the infrastructure right, charging infrastructure, for instance, at multifamily. That's an example of getting out in front of a problem, because 80% of charging happens at home. So if we don't put in the EV charging, or at least make it EV ready, it can cost 10 times as much down the road. So this is the moment where we need to be really smart about these resources coming from the federal government and positioning our communities for that. So next slide, please. Great. So, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir at some level. A lot of people are involved in planning, but this just shows you the cost just for seawalls in the state of Florida. So, it's just a very expensive proposition to address, the seas rising. And we have to do some of that, and we are doing some of that, but we also need to reduce that, the driver of that problem. So next slide, please. We also know that there is an upper limit for heat. Heat's really interesting, because I'm told by scientists that understand this, including Brian McNulty at University of Miami and Len Berry, that we can actually ameliorate heat at some level. But the amount of extreme heat that we're in for, that we're already seeing, I mean, you still, and it's September 12th now, we're still seeing extreme heat problems, and heat, is very, very deadly. And it's really the new norm. And it's not just heat for a few days, but it's the growing number of days over and over. And outdoor workers are unable to sort of really cool down. And, we're seeing people in emergency rooms. And so Miami-Dade County appointed the first chief heat officer. There's more and more attention to this issue, but we need to act now. I mean, we just had the hottest month on record ever. And so it's something we're all feeling. And I think talking about heat is helpful in that it helps people to understand, because it's something real in their life that they're experiencing. So, heat is part of this equation as well. So next slide, please. here's just the slide showing all the, really disasters, anomalies that are going on. I mean, we've just seen this rapid intensification of these storms, wildfires in Maui and California. So if you're paying any attention to the news at all, you see what's depicted in this slide, and it's incredibly costly. So again, another reason to get out in front of these problems. So next slide, please. So now we're on to the part I like, which is the solution side, right? And I mentioned, so the Environmental Protection Agency has given, and I know $1 million planning grants. And that's one of the purposes to me of this webinar, is to enlist all of you all to engage in your communities, and these plans are a great place to start. So for instance, the Miami, Fort Lauderdale region, Miami-Dade County is taking the lead, but people, like Dr. Harada will have input on that. So that's something that, again, in your community, and I know the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council is looking for people to engage and weigh in as well. So that's a great opportunity. So the next slide. And what those planning grants are doing, it's not planning for the sake of planning, it's planning for the sake of positioning these communities for this $5 billion pot of money, so that we can be strategic and smart. And that's on top of so many other kinds of grants. I know there's a coalition effort to apply for Solar for All, which is a $7 billion pot of money, and it's solar for low income people. And so there's a lot of opportunities. There's going to be $27 million coming down through green banks. Solar Energy Loan Fund is the only green bank in Florida. I happen to be on their board. So there's going to be opportunities there. So that's just one small piece. So there's $370 billion coming down, and you can go up to the next slide. And really what we're seeing overall is a restructuring of our priorities, a reflection of our priorities to transition to clean energy. But you're going to see these tax incentives, for the next decade. So we're focused a lot on the next 3, 4, 5 years for, upgrading the grid. I mean, there's so many aspects to transitioning to a clean energy economy, but really we don't have another choice, because it's climate pollution that's warming our planet. It's causing sea rise. It's causing extreme heat. And in order to protect Florida's economy and remain economically viable when all the pillars of our economy are at risk from a warming planet. So this is our moment. F. Scott Fitzgerald says the sign of first-rate intelligence is when you can hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the very same time and still function. And that describes me. And I've been working on climate and energy issues since 2000, so now for 23 years. And a safe place to be is 350 to 380 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. And like your height or your weight, it's a measurement. You might not like it, but it is. We're now past 420. And we're seeing the impacts. And for people, like myself that have been involved in this issue for a long time, it's there's an opportunity. And this is when you hold two opposing ideas in your mind at one time, that, the warming is really causing some serious problems that we're all seeing. But yet, we really have 95% of the solution of what we need. There is a need for more innovation in aviation and shipping, but by and large, between energy efficiency and solar and wind and storage and ocean energy and others, we have what we need. So we're embarking on a journey together, and thank you so much for joining this. And then so I think we're one more slide. I just wanted to put up some of the folks that have been involved in this project. I mentioned Rafe Pomerantz and Len Berry. And so we've had a great crew. Laura Evans, who leads the Coalition for the Southeast Florida Compact, who staffs that. So there's a lot of effort, a lot of scientists, a lot of experts, Ben Kurtman, Andrea Dutton, Janet Bowman for the Nature Conservancy, who weighed in on this. So the conversation we're having now at a high level is based on a lot of scientific analysis and conversation and coming together. So so that's it. I think we can go off slides now, so we can move to a conversation. Great. So I was going to start out with having Jennifer and Kathleen just each say a little something about kind of a bit about who you are and, what motivates you, what you're working on in your field. And then we can, just kind of talk about that for a little bit. Jennifer, I want to hear a little bit about, some of the recent incidents where you all had a big rain bomb in Fort Lauderdale and what you're doing to prepare your community to adapt to the changes, and then what you're doing in your community to reduce the driver of this pollution so we don't make this problem worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you, Susan, very much for the invitation to join you today. And I'm just so overwhelmed always when I hear you speak, and overcome when I look at the slides again and think about the message and the severity of the need. And I just want to acknowledge that, our leadership, I personally feel very strongly about the upper limit message. We invited Rafe Pomerantz to speak at the Compact Summit that we hosted this last year, and he did share the upper limit message there, and I think was very motivating. And I feel like this year in particular has just really underscored that we are at that upper limit. We're experiencing a lot of things, but I can just say that one, because of some of what we're experiencing, and two, because of where we are with some of our work, we just see that we're on this brink of this threshold where you acknowledge that the delta between what we can plan for and what comes next is significant. And I'll share that we've been working on our own countywide resilience plan for some time, and one of the unique aspects of that work is that we're bringing together our hydrologic modeling that accounts for sea level rise, groundwater table rise as a function of sea level rise, extreme high tide, storm surge, rainfall intensification with a 20% change factor. Our previous work, we weren't able to account for storm surge in our modeling. We now have that, plus we've brought into the equation 2 feet and 3.3 feet. Those are the kind of the shift in planning scenarios from 2060 to 2070. And when we look at the 2-foot scenario, even with storm surge, it seems like it's going to be manageable. It's not pretty, but it's something you can work with. The 3.3-foot scenario with all those compound flood factors, not only is it quite ugly, it aligns very well with what just happened in April in our community with the 26-inch rainfall event in 6 hours. And those water levels, what we modeled versus what occurred, they're about the same number. And you look at that and realize there's just no possible way of dealing effectively with that volume of water. And so there is a marked distinction, but for what we can do with 2 feet versus a 3-foot scenario, 1. 2, we're just interestingly this last week, we're in the process of bringing forward our updated groundwater future conditions groundwater table map for adoption. And we already have a map in place that accounts for around 2 feet of sea level rise, and we're working on the update for the 3 foot. And I'm kind of like, well, this is what we're needing to plan for, but everybody's stopping and pausing and thinking about the reality of what that means. And you're thinking, well, the map is difficult, but it's not the driver. The driver is something else, and it's setting in place a condition that we're needing to plan for. And you think about the difference between what can we plan for and what can we pay for. Huge disparity between those numbers. And then finally, acknowledging, if we look at the insurance circumstance of today, what I keep telling everybody is that there are a lot of factors that are influencing what's taking place right now. And I wouldn't claim that it's all about climate change. I wouldn't. I think that there's a lot that's happening in our state. But what we can control moving forward, despite all of these other variables, is how much exposure we have relative to climate change and what we do to address what we're going to express on the ground. And that's where we need to be effective, both on the mitigation and adaptation sides. And clearly you introduced the issues of heat, Susan. So I really feel as a community that we are very well able to express what that upper limit, because I know we all feel like we can't afford more, and we're looking at the design realities of the difference between 2 and 3. And that's a very tough conversation and reality to be confronted with. So on the mitigation side, I'll express that we're very interested in seeing some real progress at the Conference of Parties conference this year. And so we're watching that at the same time as acting locally. Our commission has adopted a net zero strategy for county operations as well as community-wide. We have an RFP that's going out imminently. It's in the final stages of review to that work. We have a selection committee meeting actually this afternoon where we're working to develop a community-wide EV infrastructure charging plan and incentives program to try and get EV charging into the multifamily setting, into the large employer setting, the large retailer, and figuring out ways that we can do that better, creating more options for everyone in our community to feel that they can confidently invest in EV vehicles and not be constrained by charging opportunities. We've brought that to Broward County infrastructure, opening up charging on a very large scale for our employees, also committed to a clean fleet and rolling out the infrastructure to support that. And that includes our transit. We have large scale solar that we've got about 15 projects across Broward County infrastructure. We're working on several more. We're looking at some innovations on coupling thermal and solar for where we have large hot water demands. We're fully invested in the FPL Solar Together program, offsetting 132 megawatts of our energy annually through that program, but just dramatically looking for more. And so the climate pollution reduction grant that we are partnering with the Compact in, we've all organized, we've launched our planning meetings, just see that this is this opportunity to substantially work to close gaps. We know we have many gaps, particularly in the rental arena, multifamily, large, commercial housing. So looking at that, we're also working on waste management issues, converting the port to shore power. So I'm sure that there's more that I could say, but I just want to say that I think we're almost at, I don't want to say a point of desperation, but such deep, deep critical need, but opportunity at the same time, because there are these planning opportunities coupled with large amounts of infrastructure funding to help get these projects in the ground. And we're just working really hard to bring together the partners that can allow us to be effective in all those ways, knowing that it's involving the cities and some of the community-based organizations that are much closer to where the dollars will need to be spent. And let me just finally note that we're also working on very significant green infrastructure and urban tree canopy initiatives, just trying to find everywhere we can make a difference in reducing heat, providing additional cooling that will be supplemented by the infrastructure investments that we can make. Thanks, Susan.
Wow, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you in a little bit to ask more about some of the costs and where that's going. But Kathleen, I wanted to hear from you and just a little bit about, you're just sort of corner of the forest here and what you're thinking about, what Clearwater's doing, and just your own, kind of personal commitment to this issue.
Thank you, Susan. That was quite a list from Jennifer. It was amazing. So I will just say, I'm in my first term as a Clearwater Council member. We have a city manager form of government, so we don't have a strong mayor. My husband and I have been environmentalists all our lives. And so when I was elected about 3.5 years ago, I really pushed for renewing our sustainability plan, which is called Greenprint 2.0. At that point, when I was elected in 2020, we didn't have any solar on any buildings. We didn't have measurable goals for renewable energy and carbon reduction. And so we pushed forward a number of things that I'm really proud of. But before I go through them, and it'll be really quickly, the thing I wrote here that I think is most important to communicate is, and I can't see everybody on the call, but if we have planners, if we have people that care about this topic, is I feel it's super important to model the behavior you want to see. And so if there's any way you can get a hybrid or an EV vehicle, please get it. If you can get solar on your dwelling, please get it. If you can't, sponsor some solar on nonprofits, go and change out light bulbs in churches or nonprofit organizations to help them reduce their carbon emissions. So we really focus, my family and the work I do in the city is on really reducing carbon emissions. And I also, in the very same breath, always say saving money. And so what we did was this summer, Clearwater got its first solar installation. There are little pieces on our premier park called the Sound right on the water. I mean, we are on ground zero. Clearwater is. Our logo is bright and beautiful from bay to beach. And so we are surrounded by water. And we definitely felt that with a dahlia that hit us during a king tide, a high tide. But what we're doing is, so we've adopted 100% clean energy goals. So I'm talking about the spigot rather than mopping up the floor, right, Susan? You talk about those things. So the spigot set 100% clean energy goals for both the city operations and the city at large. We have $3 million budgeted. I will tell you, $2 million is ARPA grants and $1 million is from Representative Charlie Crist, but $3 million budgeted to install solar, which at the cost Duke is increasing their rates is going to save us well over $10 million over the course of their life. And as it increases exponentially, it'll probably be closer to $12 million. We've paid for solar co-ops in our city to run Solar United Neighbors. We've partnered with a third party called Synergistics out of Texas, who comes in and just evaluates all the behavior in the city, everything from billing to zone heating and cooling, although we don't have heating, but cooling in the city to really save us money. And we've on track to save $500,000 this year just with behavior modifications. And $500,000 means reduce carbon emissions. It's also something I get to say to my residents, look at how much money we're saving. We've also committed, and I'm super proud of this, we talked about getting EV infrastructure into low-income places. We've also committed to, as part of our sustainability plan with measurables, is getting solar on the homes of 1,000 residents. So these are children, families. It's not 1,000 individual homes, but 1,000 low and moderate income residents to get solar on their homes by 2030. Now, I don't know if we're really going to get there, but the good news is we've partnered with Habitat and another developer, Tampa Bay Housing Authority, who are building 24 townhomes, owner-occupied townhomes. 12 of them are Habitat and 12 of them are Tampa Bay Housing Authority, which has a higher income threshold. But these will be owned by low and moderate income people. And we've got free solar on the top of each of those townhomes, as well as EV ready installation in each one of their garages. So I'm super psyched about that. I know it's a tiny 24 units is a drop in the bucket, but first of all, it's a learning curve for the city. What does this mean? What does it look like? What about the paperwork? What about bids? At one point they had the solar on top of those houses was something like, I don't know, 18,000 or something a piece. And I was like, well, I'll put it up for 18,000. That was too much, And so we know they have to learn, like, what is the average, what's a reasonable cost per watt to put up a solar system. So that's really good. The other thing I would tell you is I just came from an AHAC, Affordable Housing Advisory Committee meeting, which the state mandates this morning. And part of our committee talked about incentivizing landlords to make energy efficiency improvements on their home. And we would help pay for that, incentivize it, as long as they kept it at a reasonable rental rate for a certain amount of time. So again, checking off boxes for multiple goals in your city with, always reducing carbon emissions up there as a forefront for this environment. So that's what I've got. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little more about costs, because I think it's really interesting. And Jennifer, the way you laid it out about your modeling between 2.2 feet and 3.3 feet, I mean, do you have sort of a sense of cost differential between that? Because working in this clean and climate and energy space for so long, the old tape, the old narrative was clean energy costs too much, right? And again, going back many years, there are a number of us always trying to bring out what is the cost of inaction. So you've kind of, come to something very finite, right? What's the difference between that cost and that cost? To me, only underscores the importance of, transitioning. And then, after you, I want to talk a little bit about where we are on energy costs and so forth compared to clean energy. But Jennifer, can you speak to that cost differential on the adaptation side?
Yeah, I can speak to it not as well as I will be able to speak to it in about 30 days. But I'll note just first, if we refer to the business case for resilience, which I believe the Tampa Bay region undertook, a similar study. I believe there was about an order of magnitude difference in the exposures or the impacts that were apt to be experienced between a 2 and 3 foot sea level rise scenario. That was just kind of on a large scale. But I'll be much better positioned to talk about real costs, as I said, in about 30 days. So I'm excited about the work that we're undertaking because we have integrated a very robust economic assessment into the adaptation plan that we're working on. It first includes a thorough evaluation of economic impacts and exposures under all the scenarios that have been evaluated for sea level rise and compound flooding. And then when we work to develop the adaptation improvements, we'll also be able to quantify the planning costs along with the avoided losses as well as economic opportunities, et cetera. So I really can't speak to the dollars themselves, except to say that when we've looked at, for example, we entered into a partnership agreement with First Street that allows the flood factor to take a look at that on a property by property basis. And we have been briefing our leadership on this full data set. We were able to acquire the full data set for Broward County and then conduct a county-wide assessment of the total value of impacted properties under these flood conditions. And the number was, oh gosh, I don't know, something on the order of 100 billion potentially in property exposures countywide with the flood risk. And so when you're looking at that exposure, that's just on the property side. It's not taking into account all the cascading economic implications. And we know, I think that the rule of thumb is maybe 4 to 10 times greater, plus the delay that it takes in recovery to just recover your economic position. So those numbers are just so large. It's not only the cost of adaptation, but the exposures that are occurring while you're trying to keep up. And we know a lot of this is just going to take decades to put in place. We have to be planning, yes, but really working to constrain the overall investment in that area, because that's one where you're not really achieving all the other co-benefits that come with the emissions reduction, which are so significant as when we're looking at the public health side of things. With adaptation, for large part just dealing with flooding, and we haven't even begun to address all of the other exposures. So I'll be glad to share that information in 30 days time though, Susan.
Yeah, that sounds great, actually. And, I always like to think of these things as a start of a conversation. So Kara, working, with you and the other regional resilience entities, your report will be very helpful. You mentioned Southeast Florida had done a business case for resilience. And then that concept paper, I approached the Tampa Bay Partnership and they got funding from JP Morgan Chase, and they did that business case for resilience. And it's really interesting because I'm constantly reminding them and everyone, the Tampa Bay Partnership, their 8th recommendation was to reduce greenhouse gas reduction. So it was largely a report about the cost of adaptation, but within that, the recognition, and that's what the upper limit really is all about, the recognition that we really do need to reduce this driver of this pollution so we can adapt, which is not easy, as you said, to 2 feet and not make it 3 or 4. And that's really the conversation on the question, the question on the table now. So, the cost of inaction. So where we are, and someone, when you've been working on an issue for a long time, we can say things now that we couldn't have said 5 years ago, for instance, about the cost of solar, or even Jennifer, you mentioned, there is a so-called community solar opportunities now from the utilities. Well, those didn't exist 5 years ago. But here we are 75% reliant on fossil gas in Florida. I mean, in 2005, we were 48% reliant on gas, and Jeb Bush was governor and he was hair on fire about our over-reliance on gas. But we've done nothing but to add to that problem. So the biggest utility in the country, in the state, 75% of Florida is covered by investor-owned utilities, and that's Florida Power and Light, whose parent company, NextEra, while they're the biggest wind and solar producers in the country, we offer very little of that. So we're just getting started, both in utility scale, and I shouldn't say getting started because Florida's really growing on utility scale, but there has been over many years a bit of an effort to create barriers for individuals and businesses to get rooftop solar, because we understand the utility business model. They get capital expenditures, they get a guaranteed range of a rate of return on capital expenditures. So the incentive is on building generation or transmission lines and so forth. However, fuel is a pass-through. But when Duke Energy and NextEra, the parent company from FPL, own a pipeline, which they do, there's a pipeline coming from Alabama to Orlando, there's an incentive. So what we have found is, in reality, we don't do energy efficiency programs well at all. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy just came out with their updated rankings, and out of 53 utilities, Florida Power and Light is 52 out of 53. TECO improved from 46 to 40, but they're 40, and Duke is 46. They were 48. So we're 40, 46, and 52 out of 53 in offering energy efficiency. And because we're 75% over reliant on gas, when Russia attacked Ukraine and gas prices went through the roof, everyone is suffering mightily. And we've been in for rate increase after rate increase. In addition, they pass on those fuel costs. And so people around the state are hurting for that. So I just lay that out in terms of cost. So in this country right now, the real shame of it all is polluters who make money with this climate pollution. They are polluting for free because there is no constraint on that pollution. And we don't have a cap on carbon. We don't have a carbon tax. We don't have any mechanism for that, but we're all paying for it. And that one slide of where all the climate calamities are, that's costing us a ton of money. Right. So it's not like we're not paying for it. We're just not sort of seeing it. And the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry over many, many, many decades, are really significant. So we don't even pay the true cost of gas at the pump, so on and so forth. So one of the things that happened recently is in this, all the monies that are coming down, there's one pot of money for energy efficiency, rebates and upgrades, particularly for low-income people. And Governor DeSantis decided to veto the $5 million in the budget of the Florida Energy Office, which is housed in the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. They were asking for $5 million to set up a program to bring $347 million. And at the moment, that is on hold. Just in the last week, several members of Congress put out a request to the Department of Energy to figure out how they could just offer the rebate programs directly. And that does seem to be potentially possible, but that's being worked out. At the same time, there was another veto of a bill that passed in a completely bipartisan manner to allow agencies, so local governments and agencies, to consider the total cost of ownership when purchasing fleets. I think fleets is a really interesting discussion because ultimately what we're doing here is creating markets. And once a local government starts to transition the fleet, except with maybe a vehicle that doesn't exist with an electric alternative, but you're not likely to go backwards, right? So my optimism in part is if you think about the current administration's goals or the Paris Agreement, by 2030, we're net zero. We're plodding along now, but this transition is going to move really quickly. There is a collaborative led by Solar Energy Loan Fund, Solar United Neighbors, and the Nature Conservancy for the Solar for All pot of money. And it's again in the billions, and they'll be bringing maybe 200 or 400 million to Florida likely. And that is for low income people. So in fact, Kathleen, when you were speaking earlier, I want to make sure you're plugged in. So you're in that pipeline because they're going to be looking, believe it or not, it's not going to be easy to get all those millions of dollars, out the door, but it is cheaper to own an electric vehicle. It is cheaper to own solar. Solar is cheaper than gas now. And the last sort of background is I want to just put in perspective our economy and the cost. Florida sends about $65 billion a year out of state to bring in fossil fuel from somewhere else. So when we keep dollars here at home and we're making our homes more efficient, just something as simple as insulation, into people's walls and, very simple energy efficiency. A high efficiency air conditioner can reduce your energy bill by 1/3. So if you're redoing, windows and insulation and all those kinds of things, you can make a dramatic difference. And guess what? It's cheap. And guess what? You can't export those jobs anywhere, right? So anyway, I just wanted to lay that groundwork that really the clean energy transition is not only going to protect our public health, that's something I work on every day, or the health impacts of climate change, whether it's extreme heat or just air pollution, respiratory, vascular problems. I mean, there's so many things, mosquito-borne diseases. Warmer, wetter weather makes it worse. So we're really, in it. I mean, we have more warmer, wetter weather. So Kim Ross, I was just going to ask you to give us a couple questions. I know that Allison had a question.
Sure. Yeah, we've got some great questions.
Great.
So yeah, Allison Laura asks, is there a formula to relate tons of CO2 emissions to inches of sea level rise? How do you know if a measure or strategy will prevent sea level rise when carbon emissions are global, not local concentration?
Well, Jennifer, I bet you can handle some of that, but I would just start it off with climate change is a very unusual challenge because it is a global problem. But you also have to make the solutions, as Kathleen said, locally. I mean, you have to do both, but it's not just individual actions that's going to make the level of change we need. It has to be more, wholesale, national, international commitments and policies. So, it's not just everyone, driving an EV. I mean, we need that, but it's going to take something much more fundamental. But Jennifer, in your models, I imagine there are models that would equate the reductions to the amount of feet of sea level rise. That's probably what you do in your model.
Well, I certainly actually do not. I'm sure that there are global models that do that. We do know how many, tons of carbon equate to a temperature, degree temperature rise. And though the systems that drive sea level rise are also complicated, about 50% of the sea level rise to date is a function of the warming of the oceans. we're seeing, of course, now an uptick in the proportion of rise that's now associated with melting ice. And so, those are complex cycles in terms of how quickly that's happening. And I wouldn't be able to say, specifically, because there's the feedback loops are what they are. But I would acknowledge that the majority of sea level rise that will be occurring moving forward has more to do with the ice melt. We've seen the oceans absorbing a vast quantity of heat to date. And this is also one of the reasons why we're starting to see more in the way of temperature trends over land surface, because, so much of like the heat capacity of the oceans, it's been functioning as that sink. And now we start to see these really incredible temperatures on land. And the other thing I wanted to make note about energy and, energy burden, which I worry a lot about. This last summer, I just kind of did informal queries with people about where their energy bills sat. I had an individual behind me who cares for an elderly parent, and they have to keep the AC low, and they've got care providers who are coming in, a lot of $500 for the energy bill for that home for 1 month. Most people are not going to be able to provide that. Most people don't want to be able to pay that, or making deep sacrifices to. So when we think about what does that demand look like now, what will it look like forward? And this argument for the longest time from energy providers in our state that we don't need to invest in energy efficiency because energy is so cheap. Well, relative to other parts of the country, maybe, but our energy demand is constant. It is intense because of these cooling needs. The rates haven't stayed where they claimed that they were going to be staying. And for all the utility scale solar, that does nothing to insulate people who are energy burdened from these increased costs. And so that energy efficiency investment that helps them save money, where utility scale solar is not doing that for them, energy efficiency at home does, while also reducing the drivers. So to your point about those programs that are up and running and the economics for why it's so pivotal today, I think we can't move fast enough on that front.
Yeah, very good. I know Kim has another question, and I saw that Heidi Stiller with NOAA, who's in our area, in the Tampa Bay area, is on the call. If you had any more info or wanted to point us in the right direction on Allison's, question about equating, sea rise to reductions, you might have some of that. Kim, I know you had another question in the chat.
Sure, yeah. So this one's from Andrew Morris. Increasing Pinellas County's gas tax by 5 cents would be one way to pay for green transportation improvements and push to reduce the demand for gas guzzling vehicles. But politically, there's not support for this. How do we convince politicians to support a gas tax increase to fund green transportation improvements?
Kathleen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you want to speak to what happens in those kinds of scenarios?
I would say we've got to rally the troops. We've got to, my husband's chair of the Suncoast Sierra Club. We have Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. We have all these organizations. It's got to be this grassroots push, because people have to show up at meetings, because unfortunately, I think a number of the elected officials in the state are just, they might not be fully aligned. And so it's got to come from people who stand up and waive that energy bill and say, you need to do something, and we need to convert. I think educational outreach programs to help educate the public about where their money goes and what options we have to fund some greener infrastructure and to lower their bills. But one elected official can't do it. And you've got to look at who you vote for, because it's an uphill battle if you don't have aligned people. And if you don't have aligned elected officials, it's got to come from the public. And we've got to work with that kind of outreach and raising those voices, whether it's more affordable housing, whether that's green infrastructure, saving money, reducing carbon. All that stuff has to ultimately come. There's power with the vote and people. It's just, yeah.
And we've talked about costs a fair amount, and I really do think it's one of the strongest arguments. And the session before last, where the Florida legislature passed a bill that would have actually gutted the net metering
Yeah,
policy.
net metering was,
Florida actually has a decent net metering policy that the utilities have to connect and credit you a retail rate for what you generate up to what you use. If you generate more than you use, they true it up at what's called an avoided cost at the sort of end of the year. But that's a fair net metering. And session before last, the legislature was going to gut that. And
it was
ended up,
intense.
the Governor DeSantis actually vetoed it because there was a provision in the bill that was going to give the utilities basically unlimited cost recovery for anything that they were, to recover costs that, by all this solar coming online. So we still have that net metering. And that most people that work on these issues felt like it was the bills going up in the panhandle. So Florida Power and Light bought Gulf Power. It's a small utility in the panhandle. And that's because Southern Company, they were hemorrhaging money for their nuclear plant called Plant Vogtle. And so they needed the cash. And FPL told everyone that the bills would go down because they'd be part of a larger rate base. And that's not what happened. And Jennifer, what you said earlier, I mean, I was up there not too long ago for a town hall, and people are suffering. If you want to sort of see real people's reactions, I watch Nextdoor app, and you can go on Nextdoor app, and you can see people all the time asking for help with their bills, so on. So, if you, right here in Pinellas County, the Great Bay distributor, and this was some years ago, solar was more expensive, but they put 1.5 megawatts on their cold storage facility. It was, they paid that off in 5.15 years. So when you're starting to get paybacks, if you can finance, like we do with our mortgages and our cars often, that money, and you're really paying yourself, and you're paying that down because utility rates have just gone crazy. And historically, they go up about 4% a year. So it really is a way to get in there. Also with new developments and trying to get, this really infrastructure, EV infrastructure, solar, batteries into newly developed neighborhoods as well. So we're at the top of the hour, and I just thought, Jennifer and Kathleen, thank you so much. Kara and Kim, this is an ongoing effort to keep Florida above water and to keep us economically viable, because all of this is going to cost us. So if you all want to just say goodbye to our attentive audience today. Jennifer, and then Kathleen.
Yep, thanks everyone. I look forward to hopefully partnering on these efforts moving forward. It's exciting time, and thank you, Susan, for all your work.
Of course. Kathleen.
Thank you, Susan, too. Absolutely. And always enjoy these conversations and working to collaborate and move the needle. Absolutely. Thank you.
Right. Kara, back to you, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone on the panel. We've got still some questions in the chat, so maybe I'll collect those and send them to Susan to see if she wants to continue to address them. And then I've recorded this. I'm going to work on trying to edit it and get it on our YouTube. And I know I saw someone wanted a transcript, so I think YouTube will transcript that for me. But thank you everyone for attending. I think this was a great conversation. Thanks everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.